So first, congratulations on the publication of your book, Phil, and thank you for taking the time to speak a little bit with me about it. I do have a few questions to ask you, so shall we get started?
Yeah, that would be great.
Your book makes a strong argument that mental illness is a social justice issue. Can you explain that a bit?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. And I think it's probably helpful to look at two parts. One is causes of mental illness, and then the other is treatment. And so if you think about, as we know from our public discourse today, we live in a society of incredible inequity, where the top 10% has a third of the nation's income, and the lowest 10% has just 2% of the nation's income. In these times, which have, it's really been about the last 30 years that we've seen income inequality soar like this. We've also seen a rise of mental illness, 10 to 20 times more depression, 10% of Americans struggle with anxiety. We've seen what you might call kind of a public despair in our times. And we know, we'll get into this further, but we know that economic stress contributes to mental illness and mental suffering. And so in times of downturn, people are more likely to be distressed and be mentally ill. And then when the economy gets better, people tend to get a little better. But then when there's more economic stress and they lose their jobs, they get mentally ill again, or they have a relapse or a recurrence. So there's a close link between our social world, our economic world, and our mental well-being. And then when it comes to treatment, if you look at treatment, you can see that different people in our society are accorded different kinds of treatment for mental illness. So the wealthier, the owning class, tend to have psychotherapy and medication, whereas the working class, if they get treatment at all, tend to get just medicine, and of a stronger type. So there's a sense in which they aren't getting the most complete treatment for mental illness. And so if you look at how it's a social justice issue, I would say it's both in the causes that stem from economic suffering and then in the kinds of treatment that are available once mental distress is in place.
One of your sources in the book, Judy Chamberlain, coined the phrase mentalism to refer to prejudices against those who are either experiencing mental distress or who have been diagnosed with a mental illness. What are the symptoms? I hear mentalism, I think, sexism, racism. What are the symptoms of mentalism?
Yeah. Well, there's a kind of play in the question, too. The symptoms of mentalism are symptoms that are affecting all of us as a society, not just the person who is struggling with mental illness. So the mentalism, like racism or sexism, is both a set of practices that are discriminatory against people who have mental distress, and also a set of unconscious stereotypes or attitudes that just arise somewhat naturally. It seems like when you encounter someone who speaks a little differently or talks a little differently, maybe speaking to themselves or something like that. Mentalism is manifested when people in communities are just rounded up by the police for being out of the ordinary and put in prison. So a lot of people face mentalism as they're incarcerated for their mental illness. And it also, just like other oppressions, racism or sexism, mentalism can kind of go inward. So people can have an internalized sense of oppression. Once they've become a psychiatric patient, they may trust themselves less or may feel shame about their psychiatric history. Or they may sense that they're kind of a bad person at some level, not trustworthy. And that's the internalized effects of mentalism in the individual that I think we can approach through our care and counseling methods.
Can one social class really influence or contribute to his or her mental health? And flip side, is mental illness interpreted differently depending upon one's social class?
Well, that's a really great two-part question. Let's start with the second part. One's mental illness is definitely interpreted differently depending on one's social class. So people who are poor are more likely to be given diagnoses of mental illness, and more severe forms of mental illness are diagnosed among the poor. This first question about whether one's social class can contribute to one's mental illness, this is kind of a chicken or egg question in the field. On the one hand, some people have said, well, maybe mental illness contributes to poverty. On the other hand, people have said maybe poverty actually contributes to mental illness. The evidence is really weighted toward the latter. So there's a really strong relationship between when there's economic stress in a society, more people have mental distress and suffer psychiatric symptoms. That's becoming more and more well established in big studies, big analysis. And you can see it in things like people are more likely to be anxious or depressed if they don't own their own home or car, or if they don't get income from investments. Social class is a tricky word. It doesn't just mean your income or your education. It means what you have to do for a living. So someone could own a company but have very low income, and they'd be in a different social class. And then people who only rely on their bodies or their labor for work are in a different kind of social class as well. And I think one other thing we have to consider when we talk about social class is disability. So people who are disabled are also, and are outside the economy, are also in relationship to the other social classes. So it's really clear that social class does directly impact one's mental health. And it's actually through dealing with social class that we could treat mental suffering in a more rich and complex way that could lead to real solutions.
You seem to find a strong link between the suffering that's associated with mental illness or distress and the phenomenon of neoliberalism. Can you describe that link for us?
Neoliberalism is, which began in the mid-70s, early 80s, is a economic philosophy of the free market that says the free market, if unregulated, leads to benefits for all as it grows. And that's the economic philosophy. There's also a kind of culture of neoliberalism in our times with a real emphasis on personal responsibility and initiative. So we hear all the time in a neoliberal era about the entrepreneur. It's really lifted up as kind of the hero. Neoliberalism seems to presume that everybody in a society kind of has equal access or equal footing to begin with. And at the same time, we've seen this huge rise in inequality economically in an era of neoliberalism. At the same time, the media bombards us with images of the super rich that seem to kind of naturalize their wealth. And then blaming the poor for using the social safety net at the same time. So I think neoliberalism is really a feeling that you should be able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps when there's really not enough resources to go around for you, and you're struggling at a very basic level. One person with a psychiatric history who had been injured at work was trying to get workman's compensation, and he described himself as a liability. He was using the words of the marketplace or of neoliberalism to describe his own self. So in an age of neoliberalism, mental suffering is another site for self-blame. I can't achieve. I can't be industrious enough. I can't be an entrepreneur of myself.
You observe in the book, Phil, that modern American psychiatry tends to disregard a patient's social circumstances and prefers to interpret or diagnose a person based upon what you call a biomedical framework. First, what does that phrase mean, and what are the inherent dangers to such an approach?
Well, I'll answer your question somewhat indirectly by sharing this fact statistic from the World Health Organization that in the societies that have the largest gaps between the rich and the poor, there are much lower rates of recovery from schizophrenia. And in societies where that gap is smaller, there are much higher rates of schizophrenia. The biomedical framework just can't completely account for those kinds of social macro factors. It tends to see illness as existing within the brain or genes of an individual, and it tends to see pharmaceuticals as a key that fit directly into that illness, unlocking it or treating it directly. But one thing we know is that the social world is much more inextricably connected with mental illness and mental suffering. I would say the biomedical framework is preferable to approaches in the past that blamed particular parents for the mental illness of their children, or approaches, for example, that rely on ideas of demons or that kind of thing. But the biomedical framework, by stressing the individual so completely, misses the context of their social and political situation, which, as we've seen, is essential to both the causes and the course of mental illness over time.
You use the phrase Psy-Complex, even in the subtitle of your book, and as I read it, it had an ominous kind of a tone to it. I thought immediately of Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex. And I'm just wondering, what is the Psy-Complex? And why must, as your subtitle says, its discourses be resisted?
I agree. It does have an ominous tone, and I'm a part of the Psy-Complex, right? With my training and credentials, the Psy-Complex loosely refers to those working in psychology, psychiatry, counseling, mental health counseling, and it does refer back to this early time in the history of psychology when they were doing a lot of measurements on people to see if they were fit for war. That's kind of the birth of early psychology in this country. But today, for my purposes in the book, I'm using the Psy-Complex as a way to describe how our systems kind of use a subtle form of social control with our psychiatric diagnoses and our labels and our practices. And so the Psy-Complex, you can kind of see it when someone comes into a counseling center and two counselors are talking about that person, and they talk about that person as their diagnosis or that borderline and her family, or you see that kind of file speak sometimes when the person's identity kind of becomes wrapped up in the label. And that happens as well when people make case conferences about clients without them knowing and talk about their problems in just in terms of Psy-Complex notions rather than in terms of their whole social world. There was a group that was meeting there was a group of patients who were meeting at a psychiatric hospital, and this is to turn to your question of how they can be resisted. And those patients, as they were meeting in a group, preferred everyday language to describe their difficulties, and they preferred to talk about their coping strategies rather than just focusing on the symptoms alone. And they were living in the discourse of the Psy-Complex, but resisting it at the same time in that fashion. So people work in the Psy-Complex in a lot of ways, in social service, giving welfare, in those kinds of settings, but they have to make complex decisions about people and their lives. The Psy-Complex is a way to talk about the kind of social control that's exerted even when psychology doesn't realize it's doing so.
How are psychiatric patients marginalized?
Well, there's a lot of ways that psychiatric patients are marginalized. So the question is a large one. I'd start just by saying that people with diagnosed with serious mental disorders have an 80 or 90% higher unemployment rate than the regular population. So there's a form of kind of marginalization in that fact. I think there's a marginalization as well if we just rely on just exclusively psychiatric models to understand their experience. and we don't address social factors such as economic stress, then we miss a significant part of their story or what they're experiencing. Psychiatric patients are marginalized in some sense because their struggles are invisible. Some people have a hidden psychiatric history that they don't talk about. Other people, it's pretty clear that they're different, but they're marginalized because maybe they live at home and they lack access to resources, or they don't have a place to talk about their own experience of mental distress besides the clinic or the counseling center, which are so influenced by symptom models. People often describe their own experiences of psychiatric distress in ways that are different from experts or professionals, and they want their voice to be heard. So, for example, one patient said, "You'll never understand my mental illness unless you understand racism in this society."
Is the psychiatric establishment, the Psy-Complex, I guess, misusing its power?
Well, that's a complex question. I'll just start by saying that I think some of the best critiques of the psychiatric establishment are from within the psychiatric establishment. So there's this tradition of social psychiatry that looks at the society and sees how sick the society is, right, in a sense. And there's also people who are drawing attention to social factors within psychiatry itself. There's in all of our fields, there's a given power differential. I think that's heightened in psychiatry because of the fact that so many psychiatrists are in the wealthier class, while so many of their patients are in the working class or even contingent classes. So there's that power differential is heightened by the economic difference there. I think we also have to talk about the influence of psychopharmaceutical companies. They really shape the research agenda of the psychiatric field, and they're actively marketing within the field. So it's hard to get literature that strikes you as objective because so much of it is supported by the pharmaceutical industry. That's one way in which there's a misuse of power in psychiatry because it's being funded by the very people who are creating the products which are being sold. So there's a problem with objectivity there. I would say there's psychiatrists and counselors who can do their job well, even in those fields. But I think it requires really kind of critiquing the given ways of operating.
The injustice that you describe in the book is sort of maddeningly multidimensional. As I was reading it, I saw medical, political, economic, and ethical concerns, just to name a few. Considering its complexity, is this an intractable problem?
First, let me address the question by saying I think the complexity is an important part of solving the problem. So I have especially focused on economic factors and social class in this book because I believe, and research is starting to show, that by addressing the conditions of the entire society, we can create a healthier society, a mentally healthier society. So I don't think the problems are intractable. I think they have to be seen in their complexity in order for us to address them at any more than an individual level putting a Band-Aid on a problem. I would say you can see just beginning to talk about social class is a huge first step, and talking about it in ways that confront the conditions of capitalism. We don't have to be afraid of critiquing capitalism in our society. One of the patients who I quote in the book said he's looking for a drug to cure the world of capitalism. That's his hope. We've seen, here's some hopeful information. We've seen that raising the minimum wage by about $3 an hour in a large city contributed to the well-being, the psychological well-being of the whole city in some measurable ways. So there's really the macro solutions could maybe do the most good in addressing the problem. But I think we have to see the problem as involving these macro factors, such as economic distress.
You spend a fair amount of time examining the experiences of those who have survived the Psy-Complex and are now reclaiming some authority over their lives. What role can they play in changing the system? And in a related question, then, how important is community action?
Well, I'll begin by saying that it's people who've been through the mental health system who have the central role in changing it, I think. And in a sense, experts like myself should maybe play a background role and provide something like a forum for the concerns, or maybe access to institutional resources, but not set the agenda for such concerns, right? That would be within a community itself that decided certain things were important. I think community action is essential, and it really depends. The different kinds of actions can be undertaken in different spaces depending on what the concerns are. For example, one gentleman that I knew was going around and going to mental hospitals where there were mass graves with just numbers on them, and finding out the names and putting plaques on those graves as a way of memorializing the dead. And that was a form of social justice for this individual, and I think has profound theological overtones. I think the kind of activism we might want to support the most, or communal action as you call it, would be in addressing the core conditions in our society between the haves and the have-nots. And really deconstructing the idea that those are natural somehow. I think that would be one of the ways I would want to focus my resources in communal action in this area.
Are pastoral ministers and counselors in some respect first responders? And if so, what training can prepare them to deal justly and effectively with those who are experiencing mental distress?
Well, that's a great question. Pastoral counselors, ministers, they are direct responders. Persons with mental suffering, mental illness, are more likely to see a minister than they are a psychiatrist. About a quarter of people will come to a minister first. Maybe 16% will see a psychiatrist first. I think pastors and counselors have somewhat different roles, but what links them is you're able to see what's happening in the broad society, even while you see what's happening in the individual life, and I think that provides a resource for them. So rather than seeing somebody who comes to them with mental distress as just being a person with symptoms, you kind of can externalize it and say, isn't that the kind of story that's happening to all of us? I mean, you're close enough to this kind of economic suffering in the culture that we live in. You can tell stories about poverty in your community that make it sound as if it's a shared experience that we're all undergoing. That linking of the social world to the individual world is so important in this. I think counselors can play a specific role in addressing the shame that so often accompanies talking about social class. If you understand how the changes of neoliberalism have come about in the last couple decades, it's not any one individual's fault for feeling distress in times like these. So you can help people resist shame when they have to do things like pay with food stamps at the checkout counter. The kinds of shame that come from being in a society where being working class is marginalized. Counselors can help by actively talking about social class. They can ask questions like, if you could take a snapshot of your day and show it to a rich person, what would you tell them? You can ask questions about working, like, have you ever done something to help another worker that your manager wouldn't approve of, or something like that? You can kind of ask questions that bring out the conditions of working in our time, because people want you to actively address their social class. They want it to be addressed in counseling in order for that to be an authentic relationship that really speaks to their needs in their current situation.
Are you optimistic about finding a just and lasting solution?
I am optimistic about finding a just solution. And I think as I said already, I think one of the most important things is that we begin to talk about economic suffering and social class. That's a conversation that's begun in our national sphere, but I think it needs to affect these disciplines too, like pastoral care and counseling. we need to talk really specifically about what's happening in people's lives. I think that raising consciousness, both about the effects of what it's like to be diagnosed with mental illness, and then the effects of what it's like to struggle with things like unemployment, debt, foreclosure, those things that affected us during the Great Recession and continue to affect us today. When we draw our attention to these really concrete factors, I think we realize we can change them in some ways. Your community might have a different set of concerns than mine, but I really encourage counselors and ministers to get involved in social action at a macro level. Maybe it's construction workers in your community who are suffering a lot of injuries or wage theft. If you could get involved in an organization like Jobs with Justice on the side and then see clients, I think it addresses something like burnout that comes from so many people suffering, and you feel like you're just putting a Band-Aid on it. But if you could figure out what's happening in your community and make some small changes, I've really seen a difference in both the mental health of counselors and then the conditions in a given community when we can do these macro interventions as well. At the same time, there's one quote that I include in the book that says, "We're ministers and not messiahs." We're prophets of a future not our own, and there's a kind of comfort in knowing that we can't do everything as well. So that I would add that as a caveat to my answer.
What is your target audience for the book, and what do you hope to accomplish through its publication?
Well, really, the target audience is educated clergy, counselors, mental health counselors, people who understand a little bit about the psychological field. And then the goal of the book is to really shift the conversation from simply symptom reduction for mental illness to prevention at a broad scale, so societal prevention for mental illness through economic justice. If we could begin to think about how we could change the conditions of our society to create a more mentally healthy society, that's really some concrete steps towards that end are really the goal of the book.
Finally, as a scholar, what value do you place on research libraries like those that we have here at BC?
Having a research library and a team research librarian is really an incredible experience. It's like having someone who is in your corner working for you in a complex field. They can understand the questions you're asking and help you with resources. You can also just step into those stacks, which in O'Neill are labyrinthian, and you can experience a kind of, you might have a research question, but when you walk into the stacks, you experience your world kind of opening up and you say, oh, I hadn't thought about this, or here's a particular issue, just by walking into a particular area. It's been really helpful for me for my work. And then I just add something about Boston's whole system of getting books to you quickly from all these other libraries that are nearby. Interlibrary loan, but also the Boston College system of connecting to other libraries in the area has been really incredibly helpful for my work. I've been able to build very quickly the kinds of questions and see the themes and research agenda for this work. So it's been tremendous, all the resources here in terms of the libraries.